The act of speaking is not neutral. It is biochemical. Each sentence you release into a social environment produces a measurable response inside the brain, a cascade of neural activity that does not distinguish clearly between intention and completion. And this is where oversharing becomes structurally dangerous. When you announce a goal, the brain interprets it as progress rather than a plan. This is not philosophical. It is neurological. The human reward system is governed primarily by dopamine, a neurotransmitter responsible not for pleasure itself, but for anticipation, motivation, and the reinforcement of behavior. It encodes signals that tell you what matters and what should be pursued again. Under normal conditions, dopamine is released in response to meaningful progress, particularly when effort leads to visible advancement. However, this system is vulnerable to substitution. It does not require real progress, only the perception of progress. When you articulate a goal publicly, especially in a social context, you trigger a reward response that mimics the early stages of achievement. The brain registers acknowledgement, recognition, and identity alignment as partial completion. This creates a false positive within the reward circuit. You receive dopamine for talking instead of doing. This is the first distortion. The second is social reinforcement. Humans are wired for status signaling. When you declare an intention, you are not merely communicating information. You are constructing an identity signal. Statements such as, "I am building something," or "I am going to achieve this," function as social markers. When others respond with approval, encouragement, or validation, the brain encodes this as reward. Approval is interpreted as success, even when no action has occurred. This is not a flaw, but an evolutionary shortcut. In earlier environments, signaling intent and receiving group validation often correlated with actual contribution. It was efficient. In modern contexts, however, where verbal signaling is effortless and execution is optional, the system misfires. You can simulate achievement without producing it. The brain cannot reliably differentiate between symbolic progress and actual progress, so it rewards both. This produces what can be defined as a premature sense of accomplishment, a state in which psychological reward is delivered before physical work is completed. Once reward is delivered, motivation declines. Motivation is not sustained by goals alone. It is sustained by tension. The gap between the current state and the desired outcome generates cognitive pressure. This pressure drives action. When a goal is spoken and validated, that gap is artificially reduced. The brain begins to register that progress has already occurred. The tension weakens, and with it, the urgency to act. This is why individuals who frequently announce intentions often underperform relative to those who remain silent. It is not a matter of discipline, but of neurochemical misalignment. They are consuming the reward prematurely, satisfying the system without producing output. A secondary mechanism intensifies this effect: identity foreclosure. When an individual repeatedly declares a future version of themselves, the brain begins to integrate that identity into the present. This does not occur through evidence, but through repetition and social acknowledgement. Statements such as, "I am writing a book," or "I am building a business," create a cognitive shortcut. Identity is adopted through language rather than earned through action. Once identity is assumed, behavior becomes less urgent. The psychological need to prove it diminishes because it has already been signaled and socially recognized. The internal drive weakens. From a behavioral perspective, this is inefficient, as it replaces effort-based reinforcement with narrative-based reinforcement. Narratives are low cost. They require no execution and can be repeated indefinitely. An individual can describe multiple ambitions without completing any of them, and each description can still produce a small reward. Over time, this creates a pattern. The individual becomes conditioned to derive satisfaction from articulation rather than execution. This is not due to a lack of ambition, but because the brain has learned that talking is a reliable source of reward with minimal cost. Execution, in contrast, is difficult, uncertain, and delayed in its reinforcement. The system begins to favor the easier stimulus. This reflects a fundamental principle of behavior. The brain optimizes for efficiency, not for accuracy or long-term outcomes. It will choose the behavior that produces reward with the least resistance. When oversharing becomes habitual, it rewires the reinforcement loop. Discussion replaces action. Planning replaces execution. The individual appears engaged, but produces minimal output. There is also a temporal distortion involved. Real achievement operates on delayed gratification. Effort is applied over time. Results emerge later, and reward is postponed until meaningful progress is achieved. Oversharing disrupts this sequence. It pulls reward into the present moment, compressing the timeline and reversing the order. Reward comes first. Work becomes optional. When work is no longer required to obtain reward, motivation deteriorates. Most individuals will not consistently choose effort when a lower-cost alternative produces similar psychological satisfaction. This is not a moral failure, but a predictable outcome of reinforcement dynamics. The long-term effect is cumulative. A single instance of oversharing is not sufficient to disrupt behavior, but repeated exposure conditions the brain. It learns that speaking about goals generates reward, while working toward them is slower and less immediately satisfying. Over time, the balance shifts. There is less execution and more articulation, less production and more signaling. The individual begins to operate within a loop of perceived progress rather than actual progress. They plan, they discuss, they announce, but the underlying structure remains unchanged. The brain has been trained to accept representation as reality. And once representation is sufficient to trigger reward, reality becomes optional. Envy is rarely expressed directly. It does not announce itself with clarity or honesty. Instead, it operates quietly, beneath language, beneath intention, embedded in subtle behavioral shifts that are often misinterpreted as concern, advice, or harmless opinion. At its core, envy is not about what you have. It is about what your existence represents to others. When you begin to pursue something beyond the accepted baseline, you introduce contrast, and contrast creates discomfort. Not because others consciously wish you harm, but because your movement forces an involuntary comparison. Humans are deeply sensitive to relative position. Status is not measured in isolation. It is measured against peers. This is not a modern invention. It is a persistent psychological mechanism. Your reference group defines your perceived standing, and stability within that group creates a sense of equilibrium. When you declare ambition, you disrupt that equilibrium. You signal divergence. You communicate, intentionally or not, that you are attempting to move beyond the shared baseline. This is interpreted not just as personal growth, but as a reordering of hierarchy. And hierarchy, even in subtle social groups, is tightly guarded. The response is predictable, not always aggressive, rarely explicit, but consistent. Doubt appears first. Small, reasonable questions that seem logical on the surface. Are you sure this is realistic? Is now the right time? What if it doesn't work? These are not framed as attacks. They are framed as caution, as care, as responsibility. But functionally, they introduce hesitation. They redirect attention from execution to uncertainty. They slow momentum. This is the first layer of resistance. The second layer is distraction. As your focus narrows toward a goal, external influences attempt to widen it again. Invitations increase. Irrelevant conversations become frequent. Time is subtly redirected toward activities that maintain the previous equilibrium. You are pulled back into the familiar, not by force, but by repetition, through subtle patterns that feel harmless in isolation, but become influential over time. The third layer is reframing. where your ambition is reinterpreted through a different lens. Discipline becomes obsession. Focus becomes imbalance. Risk-taking becomes irresponsibility. And as the narrative shifts, so does the social perception of your actions. This is critical because humans are not driven solely by internal motivation. They are equally shaped by external perception. And when your behavior is consistently reframed in negative or cautionary terms, it creates cognitive friction, a quiet tension that forces you to question whether your actions are justified, whether your direction is correct, whether your ambition is excessive. This is not coincidence. It is alignment preservation, a mechanism that operates beneath conscious intent, where most individuals are not actively attempting to sabotage you, but are instead trying to stabilize their own environment. Your growth introduces uncertainty into their self-assessment, and if you succeed, it challenges their current position, raising implicit questions about their own choices, their own inaction, and their own limitations. Rather than confronting these questions directly, the mind seeks to neutralize the source of discomfort, and that source becomes you. This dynamic is commonly described as the crab bucket mentality, where one crab attempting to escape is pulled back down by the others, not out of strategy, but out of instinct, a system that resists deviation in order to preserve equilibrium. In human terms, the mechanism is more subtle, but structurally identical. When one individual begins to ascend, the group exerts pressure to maintain uniformity, and this pressure is not coordinated. It emerges organically from individual responses to perceived imbalance. Each person contributes a small force, a comment, a doubt, a distraction, each one insignificant on its own, but collectively effective. Over time, these forces accumulate. They do not stop you directly, but they fragment your attention, dilute your focus, and introduce micro-delays in decision-making. And in systems where consistency is required for progress, even minor disruptions compound into stagnation. This is how ambition is neutralized, not through direct opposition, but through distributed interference that slowly erodes momentum. The critical mistake most individuals make is assuming that support will scale with ambition, believing that those closest to them will naturally align with their trajectory. But this assumption is not supported by behavioral reality. Closeness does not equal alignment, and in many cases, proximity increases resistance, because those closest to you have the strongest reference point for your previous state, and are therefore the most invested in the identity you have historically maintained. Your change becomes a disruption, not just to the group, but to their internal model of who you are, and their response is not directed at your future, but at your deviation from the past. This creates a structural conflict where you are optimizing for growth, while they are optimizing for stability, and these objectives are not compatible. This is where oversharing becomes a liability, because by broadcasting your intentions, you expose your trajectory to multiple points of interference, and each person who receives this information becomes a potential source of input. Not all input is malicious, but all input has an effect. Even neutral responses consume cognitive resources, and even supportive responses can create pressure. Once a goal is shared, it becomes socially visible, introducing expectation, and expectation creates a new form of resistance, where you are no longer operating solely for the outcome, but also managing perception, dividing your attention between execution and how that execution is interpreted by others. This division reduces execution quality, as focus is no longer singular. Silence removes this variable, functioning as a protective mechanism, not by eliminating external influence entirely, but by minimizing exposure to it. When your goals are not broadcast, they cannot be questioned, they cannot be reframed, and they cannot be diluted through external interpretation. They exist only within your own cognitive framework. This creates clarity, and clarity preserves momentum, allowing you to operate without unnecessary interference. Silence also eliminates premature feedback, which is often low quality when received too early, as it is based on incomplete information and shaped by the biases and limitations of the observer rather than the reality of the process. By withholding information, you delay feedback until it becomes relevant, until there is something concrete to evaluate, increasing the signal-to-noise ratio of external input. More importantly, silence prevents the activation of comparison mechanisms in others, because if your ambition is not visible, it does not trigger insecurity, it does not create contrast, and it does not destabilize the social equilibrium. You move without resistance because your movement is not perceived. And this is not deception. It is strategic omission, a deliberate choice to protect the integrity of your process. You are not obligated to disclose unfinished processes. You are not required to seek validation for unproven paths. And you are not responsible for managing the emotional responses of others to your ambitions. From a behavioral standpoint, silence is efficient. It reduces interference, preserves focus, and maintains the integrity of the internal reward system by preventing external substitution, allowing you to operate within a controlled environment where inputs are deliberate rather than reactive. This does not require isolation from all feedback or interaction, but rather selective exposure, where information is shared only when it serves a functional purpose, not when it satisfies a social impulse. The distinction is critical, because impulse-driven sharing seeks validation, while function-driven sharing seeks optimization, and one weakens execution, while the other supports it. In environments where outcomes are sensitive to consistency, even minor disruptions have amplified effects, and the difference between completion and abandonment is often not effort, but continuity, a sustained, uninterrupted progression toward a defined outcome. Continuity requires protection. Silence provides that protection, acting as a buffer between intention and interference, ensuring that your actions are guided by internal logic rather than external reaction. In systems where most individuals are unconsciously aligned against deviation, this buffer is not optional, it is structural. Without it, your trajectory is exposed to constant adjustment, shaped by external input that fragments focus and delays execution. With it, your trajectory remains intact, unaffected, and uninterrupted. Information is not neutral, it is leverage. And the distribution of information determines the distribution of power. In any system where multiple actors are competing, observing, or reacting, the individual who controls what is known and what is hidden gains a structural advantage. This is the principle of information asymmetry, a condition where one party possesses more, or better, information than another, and uses that imbalance to influence outcomes. The 1% understand this at a fundamental level. They do not simply accumulate capital, they accumulate informational advantage. They observe more than they reveal. They analyze more than they announce. They build quietly, not because secrecy is aesthetic, but because exposure creates vulnerability. Most individuals operate in a state of informational symmetry. They reveal their intentions, their plans, their ambitions, often in real time. They broadcast progress, share ideas prematurely, and expose strategies before they are tested. This creates a balanced field where others can observe, interpret, and react. In such an environment, advantage is minimal because everyone has access to the same signals. The elite avoid this structure entirely. They operate in asymmetry. They gather information continuously, studying markets, people, behaviors, and systems, while revealing as little as possible about their own movements. This creates an imbalance. They see more than they are seen. They understand more than they are understood. This imbalance is not abstract. It produces real, measurable effects. When others lack information about your direction, they cannot accurately respond. They cannot compete effectively. They cannot interfere with precision. Their actions become reactive rather than strategic. Operating in the dark is not about secrecy for its own sake. It is about control. Control over timing, control over perception, control over exposure. When you reveal information, you surrender a portion of that control. You allow others to form opinions, to anticipate your moves, to position themselves relative to you. Every piece of information you disclose becomes a variable in someone else's decision-making process. Even if their response is passive, it still alters the environment. It introduces noise. It creates unintended consequences. And in systems where small changes can compound, these consequences become significant. Silence eliminates this variable. It reduces the number of external reactions that must be managed. It allows you to operate within a controlled informational environment where the only inputs are those you deliberately choose. This creates clarity, and clarity enhances execution. There is also a tactical advantage in being underestimated. When your capabilities are unknown or minimized, you are not perceived as a threat. This reduces scrutiny. It lowers resistance. It allows you to move without triggering defensive responses from others. Humans allocate attention based on perceived importance. Visible ambition attracts attention. Attention attracts evaluation. Evaluation attracts competition. When you signal that you are pursuing something significant, you place yourself within the field of observation. This has consequences. Others begin to track your progress. They analyze your behavior. They form expectations. Some may attempt to replicate your ideas. Others may attempt to challenge or undermine them. Even passive observers contribute to pressure, because visibility creates expectation, and expectation creates constraint. When you operate in the dark, this chain reaction does not occur. Your actions are not widely observed. Your progress is not continuously evaluated. You are not forced to perform within a visible narrative. This removes a layer of psychological pressure and strategic complexity. Being underestimated is often perceived as a disadvantage. It is not. It is a form of camouflage. When others assume you are operating at a lower level, they allocate fewer resources to monitoring or competing with you. They direct their attention elsewhere, toward visible targets. This creates space. Space to experiment. Space to fail without consequence. Space to refine systems before they are exposed to external judgment or competition. This is critical in the early stages of any venture. Most ideas are fragile at the beginning. They require iteration, adjustment, and time to stabilize. When exposed too early, they are subjected to external pressures that can distort their development. Feedback arrives before the structure is ready to receive it. Criticism is applied to incomplete models. Expectations are imposed on untested systems. This can alter decision-making, leading to premature optimization or abandonment. Operating in secrecy protects against this. It allows the system to develop internally until it reaches a level of resilience where external input becomes useful rather than disruptive. There is also a defensive component. Visibility creates targets. When your intentions, strategies, or progress are known, they can be opposed. Competitors can position themselves against you. Critics can attack your approach. Even well-meaning individuals can introduce friction through unsolicited input. A target must first be identified before it can be engaged. If your trajectory is not visible, it cannot be directly opposed. This does not eliminate all forms of competition, but it removes targeted interference. Others may act within the same environment, but they are not specifically reacting to you. This distinction matters. General competition is diffuse. Targeted opposition is precise. Precision increases effectiveness. By remaining unseen, you avoid becoming a focal point for that precision. Information asymmetry also affects negotiation and decision-making. When you possess more information than others, you can make more accurate assessments. You can identify opportunities that are not obvious. You can anticipate reactions before they occur. At the same time, by revealing less, you prevent others from making accurate assessments about you. They operate with incomplete data. Their predictions become less reliable. Their strategies become less efficient. This creates a consistent edge. It is not dependent on intelligence alone. It is structural. The asymmetry itself produces advantage. This principle applies across domains. In markets, those with better information identify mispriced assets. In business, those with deeper insight into systems create more efficient operations. In social dynamics, those who observe more than they reveal maintain control over perception. The pattern is consistent. Information is accumulated quietly. Action is taken deliberately. Results are revealed selectively. This sequence preserves advantage. Reversing the sequence destroys it. Most individuals act first, reveal immediately, and then attempt to manage the consequences. This exposes them to unnecessary variables. It forces them into reactive positions. It reduces their ability to control outcomes. The 1% invert this process. They observe extensively, act quietly, and reveal only when the outcome is secured or when visibility becomes strategically beneficial. Timing is critical. Information is not just about what is known, but when it is known. Early disclosure invites interference. Delayed disclosure consolidates advantage. By the time others become aware, the system is already in motion, already stabilized, already positioned. At that point, reaction is too late to prevent the outcome. This is the essence of operating in the dark. It is not avoidance. It is positioning. You are not hiding out of fear. You are withholding out of strategy. Every system you build, every move you make, exists within an environment of observers. Some are passive, some are active. All are influenced by the information available to them. By controlling that information, you control their ability to influence you. This creates a form of autonomy that is not visible, but highly effective. You are less affected by external noise, less constrained by perception, less exposed to interference. And over time, this compounds. Small informational advantages accumulate into larger strategic advantages. Each decision is made with greater clarity. Each action is taken with greater precision. Each outcome builds upon a foundation that was protected during its most vulnerable stages. No one can attack a target they do not know exists. No one can interfere with a system they cannot see. And in a world where most individuals are constantly signaling their intentions, broadcasting their progress, and exposing their strategies, the one who remains silent, who observes more than they reveal, who builds without announcement, operates under a different set of conditions. Conditions where advantage is not competed for openly, but constructed quietly. Where power is not displayed, but retained. Where outcomes are not predicted by others, but realized before they are understood. This is the strategic advantage of operating in the dark. It is not dramatic. It is not visible. But it is decisive. Execution is not emotional. It is mechanical. And the primary obstacle is not complexity, but interference, most of which originates internally, from the ego's constant demand to be seen, acknowledged, and validated. This demand is subtle, but persistent. It seeks expression through talking, through signaling progress, through revealing intention before results exist, and every time it is satisfied, it weakens execution. The first step is removal, not optimization, not improvement, but elimination of unnecessary outputs, specifically the impulse to announce. You do not need to tell people what you are building. You do not need to explain your direction, and you do not need to seek agreement. These behaviors do not accelerate progress, they fragment it. Validation is a resource, and like any resource, it can be misused. When consumed too early, it reduces the drive required to produce real outcomes. The protocol is simple. Starve it. Do not feed the need to be recognized for unfinished work. Do not convert internal goals into external statements. Keep them contained, undefined to others, clear only to you. This creates tension, Intention is necessary, because without it, there is no sustained action, no internal pressure driving consistent execution over time. The second step is controlled disappearance, a defined period where visibility is intentionally reduced, not as avoidance, but as strategy. And 6 months is sufficient, not because of time itself, but because it is long enough to break existing patterns and establish new ones. During this period, your environment must be simplified. Inputs are reduced to only what is necessary for execution. Social noise is minimized, and conversations that do not contribute to the objective are removed. You are not isolating completely, but you are filtering aggressively, creating a space where your attention is no longer fragmented by irrelevant stimuli. Your output is also restricted. You do not share progress updates. You do not document the process publicly, and you do not seek feedback unless it is functionally required. The system you are building exists in a closed loop, where action leads to adjustment, and adjustment leads to further action, without external interference shaping the direction prematurely. This is where most individuals fail, because silence feels unproductive. There is no visible proof of movement, no acknowledgement, no reinforcement from others, and the only signal of progress becomes internal, measured by what has been built rather than what has been said. This discomfort is often misinterpreted as stagnation, when in reality, it is the absence of artificial reward. This is the point. You are shifting the reward system away from perception and toward reality, replacing external validation with measurable output. Each day becomes structured around execution, not motivation or inspiration, but predefined tasks that move the system forward in a concrete way. You build assets, not activity, something that continues to produce value once created, without requiring equivalent ongoing effort. The focus becomes narrow, directed toward one system at a time, because multitasking dilutes output and fragments attention. You are not exploring multiple possibilities simultaneously. You are constructing a single functional mechanism that can operate independently of your time. This constraint increases efficiency because all resources are aligned toward a single objective. Progress is measured objectively based on what exists now that did not exist before, and what functions now that did not function before. This removes ambiguity, eliminating the illusion of progress created by planning or discussion. You are either building or you are not, and the distinction becomes clear. During this phase, resistance will appear, not externally, but internally, in the form of impulses to share, to check for validation, or to break silence for temporary relief. These impulses are predictable, and they are not signals to act, but signals to maintain constraint. Each time you resist, you reinforce the structure, and each time you give in, you weaken it. This is not about discipline in the abstract. It is about maintaining a system where inputs and outputs are aligned with the objective. Anything that does not contribute is removed, not because it is inherently negative, but because it is irrelevant to the current phase of execution. Over time, the system stabilizes, the noise decreases, focus becomes consistent, and execution turns automatic rather than forced. The absence of distraction allows for continuity, and continuity produces results. The system begins to take shape, gradually at first, and with increasing clarity. At a certain point, results emerge, not as announcements or intentions, but as tangible outcomes, a system that produces, a structure that functions, an asset that exists independently of your immediate effort. At this stage, visibility becomes optional, because the outcome is no longer dependent on perception. It is already secured. This is the difference. Most people seek attention before results, while the 1% allow results to generate attention. One approach is fragile, dependent on external validation, while the other is stable, grounded in objective output. When results create the noise, they carry weight. They do not require explanation, and they are not dependent on interpretation. This is the only form of validation that compounds, because it is rooted in reality rather than perception. Everything else is temporary, fading as quickly as it appears. The final adjustment is permanent restraint, because even after results are achieved, the impulse to overshare does not disappear. It must remain controlled, as information is still leverage and exposure is still risk. The same principles apply at every level. You reveal strategically, not impulsively, maintaining asymmetry and protecting what has been built. This approach is not dramatic. It is methodical, controlled, and effective, relying not on intensity, but on consistency and structure. The instruction is simple: reduce output, increase execution, remove noise, construct assets, and allow time to compound what you have built. When the urge to speak appears, recognize it as a distraction, a request for immediate reward at the expense of long-term outcome, and ignore it. Return to the work, maintain focus, keep your mouth shut, keep your head down, and continue building. If you want more systems like this, more frameworks built on asymmetry, control, and execution, subscribe to Asymmetric Edge, where the focus is not on motivation, but on structure, not on noise, but on results, and not on talking, but on building.